Hi everyone, I'm Sally Poprish with Scrum Alliance. Thank you all for joining us today for the first session of this two-part series called Agile Meets Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. During today's 75-minute session, we will explore how the pillars of Scrum can guide us in creating more diversity, equity, and inclusion in our teams and organizations. Pamela Meyer will facilitate today's session, featuring a panel of thought leaders who will share their experience, expertise, and guidance. Thank you all for joining us. This webinar is part of the Continuous Improvement series, where presenters share their expertise and highlight the tools available to Scrum Alliance certificate holders through Comparative Agility. A few items before we get started. All webinar participants will be in listen-only mode. At the end of the presentation, there will be a question and answer session, so please submit your questions in the questions chat box and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. Also, as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website after the event. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you to everyone that completed the DEI for Agile Teams assessment. We'll be reviewing those results today and know that your responses help to inform the presentation. I'd now like to introduce Jürgen Hesselberg, who will talk about the comparative agility assessments available to you. Jürgen is the author of Unlocking Agility and co-founder of Comparative Agility, a leading agile assessment and continuous improvement platform. Thank you so much for your collaboration, Jürgen, and for helping make today's event possible. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sol. I really appreciate this. Comparative agility is all about continuous improvement, and continuous improvement cannot happen without respect for people. And without respect for people, continuous improvement cannot be sustainable. And fundamental to respect for people is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what we're going to talk about today is absolutely fundamental. I'm going to set it all over right away to Pamela Meyer, who's going to be our facilitator. Let me say a little bit about her. She is quite the author. She has written 4 books on agility already. She's a certified Scrum Master, and she helps leaders, teams, and organizations implement agile frameworks in successful manners. She also teaches courses in business innovation, organizational change, and adult learning at DePaul University. So Pamela Meyer, please take it over as facilitator.
Thank you, Jürgen, and thank you all for joining us today and learning with us on this important topic. I'm actually going to jump right in and do a quick, say a few more words about our purpose today, talk a little bit about an overview of our format and framework, and I want to share a few words and place a few things in context, and then I'll be introducing our incredible panel. Now, certainly, as Sally said, we're all here for one very simple purpose: to explore how the pillars of Scrum can be applied to improve team and organizational diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, our topic couldn't be more timely today. We've all experienced the twin pandemics and the impact of COVID and racism. And even more timely, if you're joining us live today, and especially if you're joining us from the US, you're very likely aware of the grand jury decision in the Breonna Taylor case. And so we have even more heightened urgency to do more of this work. And we don't see a hard line between our workspaces and our community spaces. And so it's very important that we're here to do this work together. And so our framework today with our panel of experts is that we'll be understanding what we're talking about when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and why it's so critical, not only to our organizational success, but to our success in our agile teams. We'll be sure we spend time and include our gut experiences and responses, because we have to engage our heads and hearts if we're going to impact change. And with our panel, we'll be doing some important meaning making and understanding the so what of this work. And we promise that we'll weave throughout our now what, so that we leave you with some ideas for best practices, things you can experiment with and be doing that are within your span of control, regardless of where you're positioned in your organization. Now, I also want to say a few words about the learning space, because this is critical. We're here truly not as just a typical webinar, but to create space for learning. And as many of you Agilists know, how critical it is that as we're learning new things, that we create space that's safe enough for us to make mistakes, for us to be learning together. But this doesn't mean that we're not going to be uncomfortable. This means, in fact, that's sometimes where the best learning happens. It actually means that, and I take my cue from one of my DEI teachers, Desiree Attaway, who talks about creating brave space. And really today, we invite you to co-create that space and embrace this idea of becoming more comfortable being uncomfortable. And this is truly critical in terms of our goals today. And I also want to say that as an LGBT plus woman who came of age and came out during another pandemic, I've learned how critical it is to have allies who step up and share responsibility for the health of our community. But I also recognize that as a white person, I'm still learning about my privilege, and I'm also learning about the ways that's impacted my experience, but I'm learning how to become a better ally so that we can improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in our organizations. And I know that's why many of you are here joining me today as well. So with that, I want to introduce our wonderful panel of experts who's going to help guide us on this journey. You've already met me, but I also want to introduce Melanie Coffey, who's PR and Media Relations Director at Crayon. Melanie is also an incredible journalist and a longtime DEI advocate, as well as a Scrum Master, so she spans a lot of worlds. And she's been a wonderful partner to me in creating the framework today, and also in working on the blog posts that are associated with this. And she's going to be wearing her journalist hat as well as being a participant, so she'll be jumping in and probing our panelists with important questions also. Lisa Cooper is joining us as founder and CEO of Catalyst Technology, and the Leadership Foundation. And she brings all kinds of experience, both as an entrepreneur, but a leader in several international high impact social projects, and has lived and worked in 6 countries. And actually both Melanie and Lisa are joining from different parts of Norway, so they bring an incredible international perspective, and also as US citizens living as expats in other countries. So we'll tap that perspective as well today. And I'm thrilled to have Jill Feliciano joining from my hometown of Chicago. She's Diversity and Inclusion Director at Advocate Aurora Health. Jill brings more than 10 years experience re-energizing and elevating DEI operating models across large scale and global organizations. And I'm also excited to have my friend Todd Williams join. Todd is Director of the Agile Transformation Office at the Standard, and he brings more than 15 years experience leading complex, high-value transformations in a range of US and international organizations. And Todd's going to be sure that we still stay in the conversation around Agile, but we use some of the lessons Agile has to guide us in DE&I. So with this, I want to toss it over to Jill to talk to us a little bit more about what the heck we're talking about when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Absolutely. Pleasure is mine. Well, in today's world, we hear diversity, equity, inclusion everywhere. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'll ground us in how we're defining these terms in the context of the workplace. Diversity is acknowledging that each individual person is unique and recognizing our individual differences. These include our values, beliefs, experiences, backgrounds, preferences, and behaviors. Diversity is broken into 2 categories: visible diversity traits and invisible diversity traits. An example of visible diversity include race, gender, physical abilities, age, and body type even. Invisible diversity traits include things such as sexual orientation, religion, social economic status, education, and even your parental status. As for equity, equity refers to the state where everyone, regardless of the individual differences, has a level playing field so that all employees have an opportunity to perform and achieve. Now, to be clear, all employees should be expected to achieve and meet their business performance goals. But in order to have equity in the organization, there needs to be an understanding of what each person needs and what they want to be successful in that workplace. Organizations who develop policies and processes to create equity in the workplace are those that consider things such as offering gender neutral restrooms or ensuring interview panels are diverse, or providing accessible workspaces for team members who have diverse abilities, or simply providing vegan and vegetarian options along with meat meals so that everyone can have lunch. Lastly, inclusion. Inclusion is an organization's effort and practice in which different groups of individuals having different backgrounds are culturally and socially accepted. They are welcome, but they feel valued and are equally treated. Inclusion is about the how the creation of work environments and cultures that enable employees, how they want to actively participate and thrive because there is a sense of psychological safety there. All right, I'll throw it over to Melanie.
Melanie, can you tell us more about why we're talking about this and why it's such a critical aspect for our work in organizations?
Sure thing. Well, while we're talking about this, first off, I'd like to, Solly, if you could launch the poll. We'll have a poll going for all of our participants to participate in. I feel my company is doing enough to improve DEI, and I feel my company is doing enough. You have to say whether you're strongly agreeing, disagreeing, neutral, etc. So while we're talking about this should be more than just a trend or a hashtag. At the end of the day, it's having a strong performance in diversity, equity, and inclusion. It just makes good business sense. It's good for profits, it's good for innovation, and it's good for retention. So now, Solly, I'll ask you to share the results of the poll so far. And it looks like there's a big agreement among people who think that the company is doing enough to improve DEI, but there are also some folks who strongly disagree. So whether the team is doing enough to improve DEI, there are 21% that strongly agree, 41% that agree, neutral is 25%, disagree 11%, and strongly disagree is 2%. So we have a pretty wide range here. Well, I just want to bring out some statistics to make sure that you're aware of that back up why it's good for profits, good for innovation, and good for retention. According to McKinsey, companies with more culturally and ethnically diverse executive teams are 33% more likely to see better than average profits. Companies with above average diversity produce a greater proportion of revenue from innovation. That figure was 45% as opposed to the companies with below average diversity, and that was only 26%. Also, when it comes to retention, the stronger your diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, the higher your retention rates tend to be. And it's not just retention, but it's recruitment. Glassdoor found that 67% of job seekers say that diversity is an important factor when finding a new employer. So across the board, the numbers show that diversity is a good thing, right? Well, actually it's not. There's some instances where it's not. According to research, sometimes the more diverse a team is, there can be a lack of social cohesion, which creates miscommunication and can cause friction. This is where inclusion comes in. It's important for all team members, just like Jill said, to feel included and that they have an equal say. Having an open and transparent operations, being introspective as a team, and being willing to adapt and make the necessary changes to foster inclusivity are all factors in being successful in this space. So that's the business case.
Excellent. Thank you, Melanie. And I so appreciate that. Clearly, and there's some research that shows that if we're going to sustain organizational change, we do need to be making this business case. We all know, of course, it's the right thing to do. It's where our hearts and minds live, but to sustain it, this business case is important to make and to continue making. And I want to now that we've laid an initial foundation, and for some of you, this has been a little bit of a review in the DEI space, but now I want to bring Todd in, our Agilist, and let's stitch these two worlds together because they really shouldn't be two worlds. We're really talking about one world. And let's connect these to some fundamentals in the Agile space and a principle that many of you are familiar with. So Todd, if you could just say a couple of words about one of these core principles that came from the Agile Manifesto and why it's so important in Agile, and then we'll start weaving all of this together.
Yeah, so thank you, Pamela, and good day to everyone from all over the country. So yeah, let's kind of unpack this. So individuals and interactions over process and tools, as we know, is one of the core key foundational principles in Agile, right? Started with the Agile Manifesto. And as we kind of unpack this whole discussion around diversity and inclusion, if we have a lack of trust that's not there, we don't have the psychological safety that's not there, all these other inputs that goes into us having courageous conversations, we know that wouldn't even exist. So what we're trying to do now is look at those similarities between a lot of the things that the Agile Manifesto and including Scrum has kind of built upon now about us collaborating together and having a healthy conversations and teams working together for a common goal. There's a lot of synergies in between that between D&I, and we really want to bring that out and let that bubble up. So that's what we're going to try to talk about today as we go through this whole webinar.
So with looking at Agile writ large, now we're going to focus a little more specifically on the 3 pillars of Scrum. And as I said, many of you joining us are experienced Agilists, but it still can help to come back to the fundamentals. And for those of you joining us outside of the world of Scrum or Agile, I think you'll find these principles are incredibly transferable. And one of the reasons as we were thinking about this conversation, we came back to them, and I certainly realized this, is that these 3 words, transparency, inspection, and adaptation, are exactly the kinds of things my DE&I colleagues have been trying to tell us and teach us about for years. So let's do a quick recap of what these mean in the world of Agile, and then we'll think about them as a lens through which we can improve DE&I. So transparency simply means that the team knows what it's doing, what is going on, and including how decisions are being made. Everyone has access to the information they need to do their work. Inspection means that the team checks or tests their work and assumptions along the way. And adaptation means that the team can change direction based on new information and discoveries. And Todd, I wonder if you can talk just a bit more about why these 3 pillars are so critical to our success in Agile and on Agile teams.
Yeah, I would think that's because it supports that plan, do, check, adjust model that we want to try to always be chasing relentless improvement on. So by having the transparency, being exactly saying, hey, this is the current state where we are. Inspection is really looking at accountability when you really look at it, right? So we're inspecting what we have just built over the last couple of weeks or so. So it's getting that accountability, getting alignment right in from there. And then from a continuous improvement standpoint, whatever those changes might be that we have discovered from our experimentation efforts that we just did over that last iteration, let's make those changes and adapt and currently continuously try to deliver the highest value early and often as possible. So that's really what this is all about. This is some of the key core foundations of Scrum, and any particular agility that you might have, you have to have transparency, inspection, and adaptation, inside of those things.
Right, I really appreciate that. And you know, another key element that's really significant to our conversation today is what sets Agile approaches apart from what's typically called waterfall, is that it's grounded in an empirical process rather than a predictive process. So we're not simply making a big plan up front and crossing our fingers and hoping everything goes as predicted. We're going through rapid feedback loops where we're consistently testing and seeing how things are going in a very evidence-based manner. And we'll see how that connects up to our conversation today. So I really appreciate this. And we're going to actually engage you in another poll now. Sally, if you can launch this, our second poll. There's no right or wrong answer to this, but we want you to think about which of the 3 pillars is most important to DEI in your context. Just don't overthink this, just make a quick choice here and give folks just another second. And Sally, if you could go ahead and share the results of the poll. So I think it's interesting. We're way out ahead on transparency. Of course, if we don't have that, we can't. There's nothing to inspect or adapt to. So I think we're in sync on that. But we could make a case for inspection and adaptation as well. So thank you for that. And let's focus in a little closer on transparency. and be thinking about how directly it relates to some of these core aspects. And I want to bring Todd back in. And I know, Lisa, you've got some fantastic examples to share here as we start thinking about transparency as it relates to DE&I. So maybe Todd and Lisa, you can kick us off, and we'll bring in our other panelists in this conversation about transparency, and then have Jill start tell us a little bit about how we can do this.
Yeah, so I always begin with, commitment plus delivery equals trust. You'll hear me say that all the time. And without having this input of transparency, there is no trust, right? And we see that a lot of times when that's currently not present in any type of conversation or a team format. There's a lot of chaos that has to happen. So, and again, you have to really have the culture where transparency exists, where people can feel comfortable enough to be able to voice their differences, to say, hey, you know what, I agree, or I agree to disagree with you on those points. And so by just having that presence there and people having a psychological safety and feeling well enough and really feeling that the team is really, kind of coming together where we can have those discussions, that's indicative of letting you know that you do have transparency is there. We're not hiding work. We're not saying we're further along than where we are. All those things are really pretty much kind of goes and coincide with one another. So I'm a big proponent of making sure that transparency is there. It's one of those good behavior indications for me as I kind of evaluate transformations. Is this currently present in our forum?
Maybe now I can pipe in with an example, because I think it sounds easy, but it really isn't. And my example comes from really my personal experience. I had started my first company, which was very design a project, I'd hire a team, and I'd basically give them tasks, and we'd run off and I would manage the execution. Well, one of those projects turned into a company. And then I had to think differently, but I was still in the old modus. And as a baby boomer, I started to hire a lot of millennials. And it was really almost a demand for more transparency. They wanted to learn more about the strategic process. They wanted to have their voices heard. And it was something I was maybe a little hesitant in the sort of not a normal way of operating. But so we totally restructured the strategic process where everyone was involved. And I was absolutely floored just to see the power of giving them the ability to understand how the decisions were being made. Where are we going? What is the strategy? That they also had access to the, to all the information, and that they also understood their role, that they obviously sort of a given that, when do I make a decision? When can they make a decision? And it has strengthened our team immensely into the point that now when we do other strategic projects and other strategic teams, we really sort of have in the first meeting, how are we going to manage this? How are we going to give each other feedback? How are we going to make this touch points? How are we going to work? So for me, it's, as a person coming from the diversity and inclusion space, having, these pillars of Scrum really hit home. Yeah, it's something really concrete on a team basis. And I don't want to talk for too long, but one thing I think is also important in the D&I perspective is, a lot of the numbers.
Lisa, you're
and we work. That's causation. Did I mute out?
No, yeah, you're good. Your audio cuts in and out a little bit, but if we can just ask our attendees to be a little patient, you always come right back.
It's Norway in a windstorm, so. but it was just talking about how, the 3 pillars of Scrum really show the how of diversity. A lot of the research shows the correlation. This will help us with the causation, so we can really get it right.
This is fantastic, and such a great example, and also that some of these issues can be generational. That our mindsets around transparency can also be part of our management style and our what we were socialized. Jill, I wonder if you can build on this. I know you've got some great suggestions for people, but transparency is also critical in building trust. And again, in the Breonna Taylor case today, so much of the frustration and anger is that there's no transparency in how this decision was even made.
Absolutely. It's that same spirit that spews over into the workplace. As we've seen this, global pandemic, we've seen an economic crisis. We've also seen racial, a civil rights movement within its own right over the last month or so. Organizations can't help but now be impacted by those things that we experience outside of work. So what that has done is it's really changed how we define transparency. Transparency in DEI was, hey, here are some business metrics. We look at recruiting, retention, career advancement, right? But now we're seeing this appetite from consumers and job seekers to want to understand what is your data? What does your organizational makeup look like? At what levels, what representation do you have? What programmings and support are put in place? How are you holding one another accountable, right, to really advancing DEI? And, I actually looked at some numbers. So this time last year, only 11% of Fortune 500 companies disclosed their DEI goals and targets. But recently, now 40% of companies have now disclosed this, not only their targets, but they're discussing it on their earnings call. You'll notice companies such as Uber, Gap, Nike, PwC, they're publishing their workforce demographics so that the market and current employees understand the representation, what representation looks. It also talks through, their plan to commit and elevate their DEI programming. And it's really critical as you think about acquiring new consumers, clients. They want to feel confident that organizations can meet the market needs, they can innovate and be agile within their own right. And all of that rests within DEI and being transparent.
This is great. And I wonder if Melanie or Todd, if you want to build on this and join in this conversation. It relates to, truly an intersectional experience.
One thing I'd also like to bring up when it comes to transparency is also think about being transparency with yourself. How are you approaching an issue? How, take an honest look with yourself in your mindset and how you are interacting with your team. Because I think that a lot of times, a lot of these initiatives start with each other, what I'm trying to work on, and it starts with me, it starts with me and how we can work together. And so there's another level of transparency that's a little bit of a deeper level where we all have to kind of do the gut checks that we talk about to be able to accept people when they bring their full self at work.
Thanks for sharing that. One of the things I've been thinking about as an ally in learning space is that, and I've been hearing my D&I friends and people of color be talking about, they're happy to be teaching, but it also is on us, who, the white people who have in many instances created many of these structures, to be doing the work, taking responsibility, looking at our own unconscious and maybe sometimes conscious biases and doing the hard work of change. And that's uncomfortable, but that's what we can be doing and stepping up. Todd, are we still in sync in all things Agile? Are we still in the world of transparency as it relates to creating an Agile team?
Yeah, and I know we've been focusing primarily at the team level, but transparency needs to exist in all layers. So not just at the team level, at the program level, even in the work that we do, it should be indicative inside of that. So, when we really want to focus on and talk about transparency, it's really of a mindset. I would say a part of that mindset of us being, leaders and really being able to kind of collaborate with each other and have respect for each other and people and culture. So I just think that, we focus a lot of times through the conversations and think transparency is through conversations, actually in our behaviors as well. So just want to tie that in.
Excellent, which really relates to Jill's point about, people are paying attention. Our behavior is there for everybody to view. It's often much louder than our words, and people are paying attention to what organizations are doing and leaders are doing, and any individual who might be saying they believe in D&I, but might be behaving in ways that aren't always supporting it and aren't always welcoming their other team members. And Todd, I remember in one of our conversations leading up to this, you talked about how critical transparency is in building trust. And if we don't have that, it's impossible to build trust.
Yeah, I kind of lab with that as well, so it's definitely one of those key inputs of building trust. We have to have transparency. And again, I think that takes some getting used to, because a lot of times, we do a lot of empire building and we try to fix things behind the closed doors. And, now we're saying, okay, we need to be a little bit more open with each other and express how we feel, be a little bit more vulnerable in itself. But as we kind of build our teams out, right, and we start building these relationships, because at the end of the day, it's all about relationships. As we build these relationships, we have to have a little bit of vulnerability and let folks know exactly where we are, because some of our weaknesses that we might think be present could actually help propel someone else in that discussion, or even help build together a stronger unit. So I think it all goes hand in hand.
Yeah, and to layer on to what Todd mentioned, transparency is making sure that everyone in the organization at every level, like Todd mentioned, has a voice. The challenge becomes when you have specific demographics or employees who have been pushed to the outskirts, right? And maybe they don't feel their voices heard or amplified. How do organizations create psychological safety, whether it's through processes, whether it's how they create, listening sessions to provide reassurance that it's safe to share their true perspective, their feelings? Those are the ahas that will help us form strategies that will move the needle. But it's until we really address how do we be authentic, honest, and reward courageous behavior when we see it's happening. How can we be bold when we see behaviors or actions that are not in line with DEI, right? And show the organization that those things won't be tolerated. That's when you start to create, this psychological safety, this transparency. I think the other piece is, leaders need to do a better job of understanding the different demographics and dimensions of diversity into their organization. And from that understanding, they can build the right environments, tools, and processes that will lead to transparency for those uniquenesses that each of those groups have.
Excellent. That's so helpful. And so it's really clear that we're starting with transparency, because if we don't have access to awareness of the information, transparency around how decisions are made, how where the power and authority structures lie, then we can't go any further. And Jill, I know you're going to talk a little bit more about psychological safety, and Melanie and Lisa, this is a big passion of both of yours. So we'll build on this as we move into inspection and adaptation. I'm going to go ahead and shift to the next two pillars, but I did want to pause and see if any of our panelists had anything more they wanted to say around transparency. We're good?
No, I think for the sake of time, we probably need to move forward a little bit.
All right. So as we think about inspection and adaptation, these are also, of course, critical to the practice of Agile, but they're essential to improving DE&I. And I'm going to share a couple of things that at a high level, and our experts will relate to this more in just a moment, but we of course have to know that we have DEI goals, and Jill's going to talk about some specifics here in just a moment, and that we're inspecting our progress toward those goals. Now, this particular topic was something that caught our attention. Jorgen mentioned the survey that many of you took in advance that informed a lot of our programming today. And this is one area that really got our attention. So I'm just sharing our results here. We had two survey items. One was, we have diversity goals for our team. That was one of our lowest ranking, or the lowest ranking item in the survey. And the second lowest was, we as a team regularly review our progress toward our diversity, equity, and inclusion goals and discuss how we are doing. So clearly there's a lot of work here. And the headline that came out of this is that the data indicates that participants do not perceive there is a strategic intentionality behind their diversity goals and efforts. And that's clearly critical. And some might say, well, at the team level, how much is that within our span of influence or control? But it's something, if we're all going to share responsibility for, we have to be sharing responsibility for what is and isn't acceptable, and how that relates to team effectiveness. And so it's really critical. And Jill, in just a moment, I'll have you talk more about these goals. But when it comes to adaptation, then of course, it's one thing to have those goals, but then we have to make changes based on the results of the goals and our progress reports, and also being willing to adjust our mindset and attitudes when we have new experiences and learning that challenge our prior beliefs. And as Melanie said, you know, this is really about that self-adaptation and inspection and adaptation. So this is not just about what everybody else should do, but how we should be looking at ourselves. So, in essence, in true Agile framework, this is essentially about translating, inspecting, and adapting to the very human experience of learning and changing. So I wonder if we can bring this back. And Jill, I'm going to ask you to take the lead, but then we'll invite the rest of our panelists in to talk about what we should be inspecting and how we can be adapting. So Jill, you've given us a few things already, but how about if I put your whole list up here and invite you to talk a little bit more about this and maybe some ideas for what our team folks can do, people participating on a team. What should we be inspecting?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll start by saying this. Every organization's DEI goals can be different. What that means is organizations need to be very clear about launching assessments to understand where their pockets of opportunity are, right? It may be recruiting, it may be career advancement, it may be culture itself. So I want, the audience to keep in mind that one, you have to do the due diligence to understand where the gaps are from a process, of people, and a technology perspective. But overall, as we look at DEI, if it's a business imperative, it must be connected to the overarching business strategy, whether we're looking to grow in specific markets, whether we're looking to innovate and develop new products or services. It is critical for growth. So if DEI isn't attached to the business strategy, sometimes it's hard to develop the right metrics, let alone hold the organization accountable for achieving them. At a very high level, some DEI goals or metrics that organizations should consider is one is business. So that's that strategy piece, right? Are we growing because of the diverse workforce? Two is culture. Looking at, how do people feel about their job, right? When I come to work, how do people see me? How do I perceive my environment? Do I feel like I can be authentic and give my all in a way that allows me to be creative, right? And contribute in an impactful way. Also looking at recruiting, right? As we think about those business strategies, you need to make sure we have the right people in the right places at the right time, right? So being thoughtful about your job descriptions, right? What are those requirements? Where are you going to pipeline talent? Are you looking at one specific university, or are you being thoughtful about looking across, right? The globe at various universities? How are we thinking about retention, right? Are we thoughtful about checking in with employees and mentoring them to make sure that they're achieving their business goals, and quite frankly, removing barriers that may prevent them from being successful? We're also looking at equity within our policies and processes. I think that's something that folks forget as we think about just things such as benefits. I'm a single mom. Do I see myself in your benefit? I have a same-sex partner. Do I see myself in your benefits, right? So thinking about inclusion and how it exists in policies and beyond the workplace. And then the last one is learning and growth, right? I think policies and processes are great, but if we don't teach the right competencies and the right skills, there's no way that we can successfully activate these things. So being thoughtful about what that DEI learning journey is at all levels of the organization. Some hot topics in the market right now are unconscious bias, teaching team members how to lead with inclusive lens, allyship, blind spot training, right? So everyone in the organization understands where their deficiencies are, and they can actually supplement those where it makes sense. So those are just some of the metrics that organizations are using to really gauge a pulse on how they're achieving their overarching DEI goals.
Thank you, Jill. And I want to both invite, because folks are already doing some of this conversation in our chat. Feel free to jump in the chat and share with each other any additional metrics that you're tracking in your team as it relates to DEI. And I wonder if any of the other panelists have examples of things that are at the team level that are helpful to track as it relates to DEI, or things that you're paying attention to that that we need to be inspecting more thoroughly before we can make those adaptations?
Well, Pamela, I think a piece of that, if we're having retrospectives, right? So at the end of our iterations, the teams does have a time to reflect, and we can bring up improvement items or look for things that we can improve on. So a part of some of that is as our continuous improvement that we want to do. We identify things that we either want to stop, change, or we want to continue doing. So, those can be items that the team might want to work on creating that particular safety. I think I saw a lot of questions inside of the chat. Well, how do you begin with creating psychological safety? I think we begin with doing it like we would do an Agile project. You got to iteratively attack this thing. This is something that you can't go at it, try to take the whole mountain at a time. You got to iteratively plan these things out and prioritize those things that we think will be of the highest value in the beginning, and then put the effort around it and try to start figuring out, how can we go after these hypotheses? So are we saying that we don't have a current psychological safety and it's a lot of command and control in our environment? Okay, well, what are we currently doing about that? Do we have our ERG groups that we can kind of lean on to get additional support from? Are we okay to have skip levels with our next level supervisors in order to bring up these discussions again? I think you have to pretty much almost kind of sit down, kind of dissect it a little bit piece by piece, and look at the things that might be of importance to the team or the individuals in that area, and then from there try to figure out how much capacity you're going to throw at it and go at it that way.
Thank you. I also had a question I actually wanted to raise for Jill. You brought up some of the trends in this area is unconscious bias versus blind spots. And that's a nuance that that is quite interesting. And could you what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, so unconscious bias are those things, right, that we do just naturally, right? It's a familiarity of making or tying concepts to assumptions and, to objects and things, right? Unconscious bias is something that we all have. But as we talk about blind spot is and assessments that you can take that actually help you break down from a process perspective, from a human connection perspective, where you may have some deficiencies. That could be, every time I lean into a meeting, I forget to ask the introverts if they have a question, right? It's, as I'm thinking about planning a team outing, if I have a team member that has a diverse ability, am I thoughtful about, making sure that equity exists there from there? So unconscious bias is something that would naturally happen. It's the way that we think. But blind spots and taking those assessments help us identify what those things are so that we can properly prepare and better educate ourselves so that we're aware of how we can provide inclusive spaces for everyone.
Okay, thank you. And I want to share, Melanie, you've been such a fantastic partner in me and with me in some of the writing we've done to associate with this. And I still remember this just stands out for me. And I want to share this maybe as a lesson for some of my colleagues on the panel. I'm not on the panel, the participants, that I used a phrase in one of, in the first blog post, something about, I had been blind to some of the pain or experiences of my African-American and people of color colleagues and friends. And in your comment to me, you said in such a gentle but really direct way, as a person of color, I have the question of, were you blind or did you choose not to see? And that's something that has so stayed with me, and I so appreciate. And my friend Desiree Adaway says, we don't have to call people out; we can call them in. And I feel like you really called me in, and we call people in when we care about them and we respect them. And that experience, just that one, as uncomfortable as it was for me to grapple with that, I realized, that this is such an example of how privilege can. We all want to think well of ourselves. And so we distort certain things and say, well, I was just blind to that. Or, I hadn't been exposed to that before. Well, is that the reality? Or did I choose not to see it? Or did I revert back to my comfort zone? And what do I need to do to be more intentional now in listening, in paying attention, in not being blind, or to, and maybe use different language in the way I'm characterizing my own experience. So I want to thank you for that, Melanie, but also to use that as an example to expand on.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for receiving and hearing. I think that it goes back to trust and psychological safety. We've been transparent, we've been having these conversations, and then something that sounded a little off to me, I felt completely safe to be like, hey, actually, this is how I hear it. And I think it's important to have, when you talk about allyship, when someone brings something to you, and thank you for being open and hearing and receiving. And I think that's just a real life example. I mean, we're talking about this stuff, we're all very aware of it, but every single person has isms. And that's just a part of, who we are. That's just part of being human, but just being aware of them, again, with the transparency of self. And I know, Lisa, you and I had talked a lot also about the psychological safety and what that can bring forth. And did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think psychological safety, Jill and Todd probably can talk even more about it from the Scrum perspective. But when you have a team and you're able to give them that feel that they can both be their authentic self, is sometimes quite challenging. And I think, I can't remember exactly who said that, sometimes it starts with you. It starts with you as the leader or as the individual team member, because when you feel safe, just like you were saying, you felt safe with Pam and being able to mention that, that's when you can bring up things that are actually quite difficult. But psychological safety is also so critical to being to fostering a really good team culture, and listening is just such a key aspect of it. But I have to say, it's a phrase that maybe I struggle with a little bit in my diversity field, as opposed to the pillars of Scrum, and as we're really underlining this. But the more you think about it, the more it's being able to say and be who you want to be without is quite powerful.
Thank you. And back to Pamela.
Yeah, well, actually, I would like to just have Jill continue on, and on any of the panelists who want to join in, because I think we're at the point now when we really want to talk about now what, if we've been transparent, if we've set goals, we're inspecting, but how do we translate these into action? How do we create this environment of psychological safety? And Jill, you've shared with us a number of things that, would you prefer me to put the entire bullet list up, and you can, and this might prompt our other panelists to add as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Psychological safety is one of those concepts that it's tough, right? Because how you go about it can be different depending on your work environment, the dynamics of your team. But what I found in terms of psychological safety is it's about creating the environment for people to start trying to have courageous conversations, right? And once we get in those environments, and an example of that is, scheduling a real talk session with your team and saying, you know what, I am not your leader today. I am I'm your neighbor. And here are some things that are bothering me. This is what I'm seeing in the world. I'm so upset because of racial injustice. How do you guys feel about it, right? And being clear that environment is, no judgment, that it's purely learning, an exchange of getting deeper into who one another is, both inside and outside of work. So I think the environment piece is going to be critical. And then over time, psychological safety will start to form. But there are some other things that are key signals or indicators, right, that psychological safety does exist. And one, when you see that your leaders are engaged, meaning everyone from your CEO to your, VPs down on, they're actively talking about DEI, even if it's topics that maybe we haven't discussed in the workplace, whether it's religion or race, or what have you. But I think it's very important for us to see those behaviors, because that signals to us that it's okay. I can have these discussions. It's becoming actively a part of this environment and is accepted. Also make sure that, your teams see you paying attention, right? If someone in the organization express frustration or mistreatment, we have to show up and do something about it. Whether it's developing new processes or forms to collect that feedback, we can't ignore those things. If you ignore them, then psychological safety shuts down. And then making commitment to change, right? We've seen time and time over again, these organizations are very excited about DEI. They have all these fancy programmings and internship programs, right? But at the end of the day, the question remains, are we really doing it the right way? And are we committed? And are we getting the results that we are seeking to get out of, this holistic strategy? So it's not enough to just talk the talk. You have to walk the walk. And with the level of transparency and data that, your customers and your employees have, they're watching to see how bold and brave that folks will get.
Thank you, Jill. And I wondered, Lisa, would you like to jump in and build on this, or?
I was just wondering, one question of, for everybody in the COVID times, in the lockdown times, psychological safety has creeped into our lives in a totally different way. I don't know if anyone has any reflections on its impact on that very important key.
I have a bit, maybe. I've noticed that in these COVID times, managers are now being encouraged to check in on their employees. And we're talking about from an internal comms perspective, it's a lot more emphasis in touching base, going the extra mile, since I'm not going to see you at the proverbial water cooler, just actually reaching out and having a conversation, because it means the connectivity kind of seems a little bit, we value it a little bit differently. And so I've noticed that, but I don't know, what about the rest of you guys?
Yeah, Melanie, I would probably agree. I think it's forced us to change and work differently, right? So we're seeing agility in its finest, right? We have a disruption that came in, which is COVID now, and it's forcing all of us to even rethink about the way we interact with each other. So I think it's a good thing. It's a silver lining in this whole COVID thing and us quarantining is that it has forced us, like you all are talking about right now, to find more effective ways to communicate. And maybe some of those discussions that primarily would be shied away from with a face-to-face conversation, people are feeling more compelled now to voice their differences or to really talk a little bit more about how they feel. So it's kind of almost, kind of promoting folks now to kind of communicate a little bit more. So I think it's some good things out of it now. This goes back to the $1 million question, right? Okay, well, what do we do about this now? Since the time is now and we have a short window like anything else, right? We have a short market window with this whole discussion. What are we going to do with this with this conversation? What are we going to do with the topic? How can we create these environments that our respective work organizations now that we go back to and be able to have those things? I think you start with creating some guardrails around it, right? So you have to have a few guardrails around the discussions as we tee those things up, right? We can't just go, I hate that for a lack of a better term, go gun ho over it and say, all right, you know what? I'm really pissed about the way I'm feeling or the way things is going. It's still a level of professionalism we have to keep at all times. So it's just being able to just have those discussions where it need be. I think everyone feels like the time is now. So you're doing yourself a disservice if you're sitting on these discussions right now and not bringing them up, because who knows what might be the next thing that might grab our attention or what the focus might be. So I really feel it's like the speed of business is now. The time is now for us to make the discussions.
I think COVID has forced leaders and team members at all levels to tap into diversity and inclusion in a very different way, a very authentic and personal way. And what I mean by that is, I think leaders who we've once had challenges convincing that a diversity of slate of candidates was the right thing. Now they're thinking about, oh my gosh, now since we're virtual, we really don't have the talent and the skills that we needed and the experience. They're being thoughtful about, all right, how do I recreate job roles, right, to meet new consumers' needs? How do I keep employees engaged in this virtual environment? And I think leaders and organizations took all of that for granted. And now they're starting to see why diversity is so important and how critical it is to be able to adjust, shift, and adapt.
It's such a fantastic point, Jill, and bringing it together to be thinking about truly the interplay between inspection and adaptation, and creating the psychological safety that, we talk so much about. In an agile team, it's critical that we can hear everybody's ideas and that people feel free to speak up and share the data and the experience. And if we're bracketing data that doesn't fit our desired outcome, on an agile project, then we're going to get in trouble. And the same is true as we're trying to create these work environments. And, and so being sure that people feel that they're not going to be humiliated by speaking up. A number of my colleagues and friends of color have said, that even asking for help sometimes can be perceived differently if you're a person of color, or if you're, so as an ally, I think about maybe I should be doing more to be checking in and finding out if checking in and seeing if a new team member needs help, or if there's something that can bridge the gap and really demonstrate psychological safety. So I wonder now, we've created a little extra room in our webinar because we wanted to make sure we had room for our participants to join in the Q&A. And I know also in the chat, you're having a robust conversation. Do feel free to share in the chat any additional things you're doing in your organizations to create these environments and to create more transparency and practices for inspecting and adapting. That's a great place to be sharing and learning from each other. But let's go ahead and open up the Q&A. And I believe, Melanie, you're going to guide us through this and call out some questions back to the panel. And Sally,
Yes,
you may jump in if you see anything that is particularly Scrum Alliance friendly that we want to engage as well. So Melanie, I'll turn it to you to lead us in our Q&A.
Excellent. First off, I would like to thank everyone for the great engagement with this webinar. The questions, the conversations in the chat, the questions in the Q&A part, they're all, it's really difficult to choose from. There's so many fantastic ones. So let's get right at it, shall we? This one from Pamela in Chicago. She asked, how do you get your leaders involved and or on board with DEI, considering everything that's on their plate right now, with everything going on in the world today? And I'd like to target that one to you, Jill. Considering how Todd was saying the business, the time is now, the time is of the essence. How do we get our leaders on board?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say it depends, right? So we always have to have that caveat of your environment and kind of the size of the company and that kind of thing. But, if your leaders are not paying attention or focusing on DEI, I challenge you to be that voice. The question becomes, how do you do that, right? And how do you tap into those ways? So if you're connected to ERGs, having that ERG collectively lift recommendations and areas of focus can be a huge source as a united front, by the way. Number two, tapping into your HR leaders, right? Those are the people engines in the company, right? So it's important to engage them, to talk to them, to understand the business strategy and ask questions around how DEI is being thought of, what discussions are happening that you may not be privy to. Lastly, I would say do your research and have the discussion. Usually forums like town halls will allow you to raise your hand and say, hey, I'm looking at market data here and our competitors are doing ABCD, right, around D&I. Ask them what their plan is. What is their intention? You'll actually learn that those may create opportunities for you to really connect and step up as a leader within DEI. So those are just some initial thoughts as to how you can approach it and get them engaged. but you have to ask the questions.
If I could just add something on that, because I totally agree. At least in our context, you have to present the business case. Yeah, business leaders understand business. If you can tell the leaders that, this is how we'll get more customers, this is how we'll improve the bottom line, this is how we'll improve effectiveness, then they'll start to listen. And there's a plethora of research out there, just like the 3 points that you added, that can be used and tailored. And I think benchmarking to your key competitors and also showing and analyzing how others are doing. But I think the third aspect is also bringing it home. Diversity and inclusion is so contextual. Yeah. So it's in the company. And what is the diversity context that is important for us to work on? And then through the business case, through the benchmarking, I bet you $1 million most of the top guys will wake up and see, especially if their competitors have a really good diversity and inclusion strategy.
Yeah, and Lisa, to that point, more than likely those leaders are having discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. But we found that our leaders, they're people too, right? Some are afraid, some may not know what to say or how to approach. So even if you can open that door, right, in terms of the DEI discussions, you'll find that sometimes you really unlock the gateway to transparency and starting something really great in your organization.
Yeah, and I gotta agree with you on that, Jill, because I think that we can't really forget the fact about the Tuckman model, right? The forming, storming, norming, performing, and enjoying. That could be exactly where we are in a lot of those conversations right now. We're starting to form those conversations, and we're pretty much storming through these things right now. So that's where you're getting a lot of conflict where, some of the leaders might not come off as genuine about having the discussions, or they're shying away. We probably need to be a little bit cognizant of that, as part of that overall development for them as well. They're going through an actual phase themselves. So we probably need to be a little bit more patient and maybe talk a little bit more about them, talk a little bit more with them and figure out, where we are in the situation.
Thank you so much,
Example,
Todd.
we've actually just landed at, whoops, and my internet is unstable. Can you hear me?
I can.
No, I was just going to say another avenue, and I know we're focusing on one question here, but a very large corporate company in Norway had 2 Black employees, out of the entire, I think there's 17,000 employees. Matter was something that really mattered to them. Yeah, they're at the executive level. They go straight to the CEO and they said, we demand action. And he said, okay, form a task force. Here's your budget. And now they probably will have one of the biggest diversity and inclusion program, which luckily I'm involved in, focused on Black talents. Yeah. So it also, organically find those allies within the organization.
Yeah, to Lisa's point, there's strength in numbers.
Yes. And I'd like to interject just a little bit because I know we have an international audience. Joe, what is ERG? Instead of saying the acronym.
Right. Sorry about that.
That's
Employee resource groups. And those are groups of team members who really rally around a common characteristic or mission, right? Whether it's race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or, hobbies, right? But it's a dedicated group that focuses on those common things. And they together can drive business strategy from the lens of the table in which they sit.
Excellent. There are a lot of questions in the chat about blind spot assessments. Do we have some tips that you could?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. So Harvard Business has one of the top blind spots assessments out there. It is free. So run to go get it. PwC also has released their version of the blind spots assessment. So it's also an assessment and supplemental videos that help you think about how you feel some of those gaps that you may uncover. And then lastly, Korn Ferry also has a really nice assessment that's available. The really nice thing about the assessment is it's personal, right? No one gets your results. And you can be very open and honest from a self-reflecting perspective. And then once you know what those blind spots are, you can action around it to find the right levels of education experience to fill some of those blind spots. But those three are the ones I recommend.
But Jill, I
Alright.
just have to ask, how is it different than the implicit association test from also Harvard? Is it a little bit more on a personal level?
It's more on a personal level, but there are links that are very similar between the two.
All right, I'm going to interrupt really quick, try to squeeze in another question. What are examples this is from David, what are examples of team level DEI goals besides psychological safety? And Todd, can I kick that to you?
Sure, let me come off mute. I had to come off mute. Nah, I think you start with, I think Jorgen can probably help with us. There's a happiness assessment as well that you can do. So as you know, every quarter to over quarter, one of the things we do in order to make sure that we're expecting and adapting our programs, our agility programs, is that we have quarter assessments, and one segment of that, or I would say one dimension of that, is team happiness, right? So as we start to kind of measure and survey the team happiness and look at where those opportunities are, those going to be the next plan of action of where we do. Then that could be something that maybe that could be leadership that might have to run with that from that assessment problem that comes out of there, or could be at the team. The team might want to take that on themselves and say, hey, this is something from our happiness index score that's maybe a little bit lower. Our opportunities might be something that we want to go out there. So I would encourage you to always to kind of measure a lot of different things in just performance, right? Because performance at the end of the day is great, but we also need to make sure from a talent retention standpoint and whether or not people are really happy and really have an environment that's there. You need to measure the happiness of the program and ask those correct questions. So, and making sure you have the precise and accurate questions that's around that, making sure people understand the question so you can get the correct answers that's going to be out of there and give you those leading indicators that you're going to need to make those changes around there.
Todd, you called me out. So I feel like I need to at least say a word, and I'll just say this regarding assessment. We do have an assessment coming out created by all of you in 2 weeks. So there will be an agile DEI for agile teams assessment coming out. One thing I just want to say about those assessments in general, and I think this is true for all of them, is that the assessments themselves don't necessarily give us the answers, but they help us ask better questions. And that's the whole idea here, is these conversations, those individuals and interactions that we're trying to drive. And I think that's what's been missing a lot, especially when it comes to DEI. And I think those kind of assessments that we're talking about, the blind spots, the agile teams for DEI, all those kind of things help us have more healthy, data-driven conversations that probably otherwise wouldn't have happened. So,
great point.
All right.
I would like to share, for the team level metrics, Todd, you were spot on. It's not just about performance, but we're starting to see metrics at the team level that touch on allyship, right? It talks about how team members can create spaces for other people, how they can lean into courageous conversations, not only with leaders, but with clients as well. So we're starting to see those behaviors measured, which I think is something new that we probably haven't experienced before.
All right, and Pamela, is there anything you would like to add?
No, I really was just about to reinforce what Jorgen had jumped in around, is that the question really couldn't be more perfect in terms of one of the reasons we created the assessment together, and it's based on the same questions that many of our participants responded to in the survey, is for that very reason, so that teams can start the conversation and get a sense of where their opportunities are, whether you call them blind spots or simply areas where they don't have practices. For example, many teams haven't even thought about setting goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what are the areas they need to be paying attention to. So our hope is that will really drive the conversation forward. And we'll share both more of the research in our next webinar, as well as introduce that incredible resource for everyone who joins us.
Okay, thank you. I'm checking the time. We could
Yeah, we probably have time for maybe one more question, and then we'll bring it on home here.
Okay, well, this kind of, one of the things that's from Vivian, how do we deal with employees who fear retaliation if they open up and express themselves? This is kind of a tough one for the last one, but this isn't an easy issue. So let's get at it. Kicking it over to Jill.
Yeah, this is tough. It's so tough. And I think organizations as a whole, we're all trying to figure that out. We're trying to figure out how you create processes that will allow people to communicate concerns, right? Whether it's microaggressions or discrimination. And I don't think that we've quite gotten there yet. So employees are kind of left with this bag of figuring out, well, how do I navigate this so that my voice is heard? And I would say, the first thing, create internal allies and trusted advisors, right? It could be leaders that may not be a lot part of your intact team, but get to know them to understand just who the key players, ambassadors are, and champions for you, depending on the challenge or the issue you want to raise. And from there, they can help you strategically place yourself in front of the right people to have the right discussions. At the end of the day, if you do not advocate for yourself, nothing will change. But it's scary, right? Because the question becomes, what happens if my job is accidentally eliminated, right? Will I not be able to provide for my family? So it's very real. But I would also challenge all of you to be thoughtful about surveying the type of environments in which you thrive. What I mean by that is if there are organizations that are not blatantly focused or willing to help, it's time to ask yourself some questions around where you need to be so that psychologically safety exists and that you can thrive as an employee. So just some thoughts there around just what organizations are struggling with and what employees are doing to find their way and making these communication paths so that they can alert people to challenges that they're facing.
Okay, thank you, Jill. And Pamela, would you like to take it from here?
Yes, thank you. And we have so many great questions. The good news is we really knew this was going to be such a rich topic that we created this as a two-part conversation. So the great news is that we'll continue this conversation, and I want to invite everybody to join us as we have our second conversation in 2 weeks on October 8th, where we'll shift our focus from the 3 pillars to the 5 values. So today we really laid the foundation with our wonderful panel of experts and got the conversation started, but we'll continue. And we're also going to be introducing this incredible survey instrument that will be able to be used for your own transparency, inspection, and adaptation, and show you how to use that, and share some more of the research from the survey that we've collected. And by the way, there's still time to take that survey. So I want to toss it back to Sally, who's going to share some important housekeeping. But I just want to thank our incredible panelists for taking the time. We had many conversations leading up to this conversation, and really all the time and thought that you've put into this, and will continue. And when we move into our next conversation, we'll be joined by Trenton Meredith from UCB Pharmaceutical, who will share some other perspectives about how he's connecting Agile and DEI in his workplace, as well as we'll have some of our panelists back. So we're excited about that. And thank you to Scrum Alliance and Comparative Agility for your wonderful support in helping us have this conversation. So Sally, thank you. And I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I just want to say again, thank you all so much for joining today, Jorgen, Pamela, all of our awesome presenters. That was extremely engaging and interesting. And I also want to thank our attendees. Thank you for your engagement and your participation, and for making sure that you bring more DEI to your teams and organizations. So thank you all. I do want to share that we will have a follow-up blog post coming out from Pamela and some of the presenters. We'll address some of the questions that were left over from today's presentation, as well as queue up some information for the next webinar that'll happen on October 8th. Just to echo one more time, the DEI for Agile Teams Assessment from Comparative Agility will be live on October 8th, so you can look forward to that. And also, if you're a Scrum Alliance certificate holder, please remember you can access other Comparative Agility assessments now through your member dashboard. I am going to now share my contact information. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out. In addition to that, I'm going to share the registration link for the next webinar in this series. That'll be on October 8th. And also there's a link to the DEI for Agile Teams Assessment. So lots of information, but please make sure to take that survey before the next session as well. We'll still be looking at those results and incorporating the survey data. And then one more note, a follow-up email will go out after this presentation, so you'll have access to the recording of today's session. We'll also include directions for accessing the comparative agility assessments and directions for submitting today's session for SEU credit. You'll also find the registration link for part 2 of this series. With that, we'll go ahead and close out the presentation. Thank you all again for joining. Thank you to our presenters. And we'll see you next time for part 2 of this series. Thank you. Thank you all so much. I'll go ahead and close out of this because we're still on live stream, but I'll go ahead and email you. Thank you all so much. That was amazing. And the feedback we're getting is, yeah, it's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.